Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have two very special guests. If you've been watching my show recently, you'll see Joe Szimhart. We spoke back in December 5th about Peter Thiel and the Antichrist. That was very well received. For people who don't know Joe, this will be our fifth show. He's a former cult deprogrammer and author, so he knows a lot about these subjects. We were talking about doing a follow-up to the Peter Thiel show, and he mentioned that there was a new book by Jon Atack. I thought it was his old book. I remember reading A Piece of Blue Sky back in the day, but Joe said, no, there's a new one, which I wasn't aware of. If you're watching this on my 3 YouTube channels, which magically reappeared a couple months ago, or Rumble or X Twitter, you'll see the title of Jon Atack's new book. The full title is If Scientology Ruled the World: Nazi Occultists, Sex Magic, Space Aliens, and the Second Coming. And Jon Atack's last name is spelled Atack. And I knew him from that first book that he wrote, A Piece of Blue Sky. But he goes all the way back. He's one of the earlier members of the Scientology group, is a way to put it. I've had Jerry Armstrong, who's mentioned in this book, his newest book, on like 6 years ago. I got mentioned in a lawsuit, or a threatened lawsuit is probably more correct. But Jon was involved in Scientology at the age of 19. He was never a live-in member, but he took many courses and 25 of the available levels of the bridge to operating Thetan Section 5. He left in 1983, appalled by its aggressive behavior towards members. He refused to disconnect a close friend and was shocked to find that 11 senior members of the cult, including the leader's wife, had been sentenced to prison terms for kidnapping, breaking and entering, theft, burglary, and false imprisonment based on their own confessions. He also has a career as an artist, so I'll put a link to his website, jonatack.com. He also, to help those harmed by the cult's hypnotic practices, done a lot of recent shows on hypnosis too. Over 12 years, he saw over 500 former members and helped many to recover the money that had been extracted from them by Scientology's hard-selling techniques. He's active in over 150 court cases and was consulted by many government organizations. He's given several conference papers, and his work is supported by more than 40 academics, including Professor Stephen Kent, among others. He's been subjected to constant harassment by Scientologists. His house was picketed by placard-carrying cult members. And then his book, A Piece of Blue Sky, which I mentioned a couple times, was published in 1990 after a court battle, and it became an Amazon top 100 bestseller. However, because of a precedent over the letters of J.D. Salinger, 60 passages in the book had been paraphrased. Maybe we can talk more about that. Sure. But he has blogged at Tony Ortega's Underground Bunker. I've talked to Tony. He was a member. He had done shows with Ed Opperman when I worked for Ed. And he's also an artist who continues to paint and play drums. He's also written several novels, Voodoo Child and upcoming Halcyon Days. And he lives in Nottingham and cultivates his garden. He has 4 children and 1 grandchild. So Jon Atack and Joe Szimhart, welcome to the show. Joe's going to start off by reading an article about that he wrote, a book review about what he wrote about this book, If Scientology Ruled the World. That's how we'll get it started. So Joe, please go ahead.
All right, yeah. So this review was just published recently by the International Occultic Studies Association in their online magazine, ICSA Today. And so I reviewed Jon's book after reading it recently. And the title of my review is Pee-wee Fascism, and that's in quotes. Fascism has become a political football in current world affairs, with both sides accusing each other of being fascist, like Spy versus Spy cartoons in Mad Magazine. Jon Atack, in his new book, If Scientology Ruled the World, grabs the fascist football from self-serving spies, and after deftly zigzagging through the comparative cultures of Scientology and Nazism, he scores a touchdown. Doesn't mean he won the game, but he did score the touchdown. This book is loaded with reliable research about cultural and occult forces and ideas that influenced the developments of Nazism, Scientology, and a host of other movements. Atack summons his decades of dogged investigation and experience in and out of Scientology that he fastidiously wrote about in A Piece of Blue Sky, Scientology, Dianetics, and L. Ron Hubbard, which again in 1990. So his first book remains a seminal book exposing a bizarre self-growth business disguised as a world-saving church. I think this second book gets into the meat of why this topic is so important, that if a group like Scientology, which has totalistic ideas, ever had an army, you'd have another Nazi Germany of some kind, I think. And that's the basis of what I see going on with John's newest study. So we'll go ahead, John. When did you start writing this book? How long ago was this in your...
It comes from a proposal that I actually wrote 4 years ago, which was a book about the way that absurd beliefs turn into atrocious behaviors. And the one subject I hadn't covered in that book was Scientology. And it was a year ago this August I set to work, and I gradually, what the original proposal split into 7 separate books. So there are still 6 to come yet. Whether I'll write them or not is another matter. And it's just to I was very interested, for example, in the way that the Book of Revelation has influenced so many groups, including Ron Hubbard, Charles Manson, and of course the Nazis with their idea of the millennium. But that had to be put aside because it was just, everything was getting too complicated. And so tracing back and kind of going, where does the Aryan race fantasy come from? Why is it that people are saying, that we are a distinct race because we are white? Where does this fantasy come from? And I was amazed. It's something that's not taught in our schools. It's something that's not generally known. And it's a very modern idea. It's a 19th century idea. It doesn't go any further back than that. And the books are kind of a prequel to Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, which is a history of Scientology, and as yet the only history of Scientology, which is surprising given what a bizarre and fascinating topic it is. There are more than 100 autobiographies of former members, but actually putting all of that material together hadn't happened. You mentioned, William, that the original A Piece of Blue Sky, I had to paraphrase 60 passages. The current version, Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, has all 60 of those passages back in, plus 40 more for good measure, which are all quotations from Hubbard's diaries, his journals, his personal letters, and his harassment orders, all things that the court in New York in 1990 thought shouldn't be there for some interesting reason. So it's a prequel saying, how did we arrive at Scientology, and showing the clear links from particularly Madame Blavatsky, who is, the grandmother of 50% of the modern cults, really, as Joe very well knows. And it goes through the chain of evidence that goes directly to the foundation of the Nazi Party in 1919, by a group of people, including Rudolf Hess and Hans Frank, who would go on to become, significant in the disaster that the Nazis created. And this was an occult group. Most people, Nicholas Goodrick Clark's work on this has been very good, but there's been all sorts of nonsense, like The Morning of the Magicians and The Spear of Destiny, these silly books that are based upon people's fantasies. I wanted to get down into the facts rather than the imaginings of these people. It's also the sequel to Piece of Blue Sky, saying, well, if they did actually have any power in the world, what sort of world would they create? And I think we all have this very strong presentiment about fascism as it's rising under the name of populism in our world at the moment. I'm currently working on a piece defining fascism and saying, well, what was it? And why do people want to go back to a kind of brutalist Roman Empire where, a third of the people in the empire were slaves, and it was a hideous life? And that's where neo-traditionalism, the Alexander Dugins, work in Russia, the pan-Slavic movement, the pan-German movement, and the current crop of white supremacists in the US who don't seem to have understood that their heritage has to be purely German, Scandinavian, and British for them to be included as Aryans. You know, there are people who are of Polish origin who believe that they would have been accepted. The reality is that Himmler ordered, who was an occultist, Himmler ordered the murder of 30 million Slavs when the SS were set loose under Barbarossa. And they got very close to that target. Probably 27 million people were killed during Barbarossa. So you've got this man. If you go up to, if you meet any neo-Nazis and you say to them, well, what is the Aryan race? They'll tell you it's white people. And it's not. It's people, it's Teutonic people, not Mediterraneanoids, one of the words they used, and not Slavs. It also, I don't think, has really properly been said that in the 12 years and a massive amount of research after funding the military, the most costly project in the Third Reich was proving the antiquity of the Aryan race. They spent 12 years, they did skull measurements and blood typing and calf measurements of hundreds of thousands of people to prove that there was such a thing as the Aryan race. And when it came to it, they disproved their own hypothesis. They could not tell between the different types and categories that they put forward.
Yeah, John, did you think that they were actually aiming to describe another species of human, or a subspecies that was superior? Because that seems to be where they were trying to go, when in fact genetics tells us that's impossible. But yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what Himmler, he sets up the Ahnenerbe, which is the largest ministry with 50 departments. And with that's the Ancestral Heritage Ministry, the Ahnenerbe. With that, they're trying to show that there's this distinct racial line, which, as you say, modern genetics has completely disproven. But even when you look into the historical record, if you look at the Romans and their definition of the Germanii, the Germans, it means anybody that lived beyond their border. Mm-hmm. And the tribes that were being celebrated as victors, they celebrated a particular victory in, I think, 148 AD. When you look into those tribes, one of the tribes had actually come from Asia. And they were Germanii because they were across the border. So there were peoples from the Russian steppe. And if we look at the movement of peoples, the Alans, the Sueves, the Vandals who ended up in Carthage, they come from the Russian steppe and through they go. So Ostrogoths, Visigoths, all of this, the racial intermixing is happening all the time.
Yeah, so there was a question up here if the idea of the Aryan super race came from Blavatsky. Not necessarily, because Blavatsky interpreted other earlier occultists. I mean, she claimed she was just the string that put all the pearls together. She didn't invent the pearls of the occult history, and she did a rather botched up job of it. But be that as it may, her theosophy influences probably, like you said, half of the New Age movement today, and it influenced Ariosophy, which directly influenced the Nazi movement.
Yes.
So, but as far as the Aryan thing, I mean, that was kind of an idea that appeared in the 19th century that looked at India as being ruled by the Aryans that came out of Persia. And as a result, the so-called caste system was imposed on India by the British. And where India really runs on something called the Jati system or the clan system. But in any case, the idea had to do with color. The lightest people were the Aryans, and then there were subcolors down to the darkest, which are the untouchables.
The Dalits.
And it's called Varna. So there's this skin racism that goes on in the crudest form of this, but Blavatsky and maybe you could expand on this, was really looking at something more that would be called spiritual racism, or spiritual hierarchy. There were certain people coming in the next root race which were more evolved than others, and of course all these people were joining Theosophy and the Nazis and so forth
because they were evolved.
So it was a social construct, is what she did with her secret doctrine. But you mentioned some of this in your book, and of course the whole movement of eugenics grew out of this nonsense of superior races and having to get rid of inferior people that were brain damaged or whatever. But you do quite a job in one of your chapters on the whole eugenics movement that started in the U.S. mainly and was then incorporated into the Nazi movement.
And that's a very important point, that the US was the first place to actually legalize the sterilization of people who were considered life unworthy of life, as the Nazis would put it. I think Connecticut in the 1890s brought in the first eugenics law, and Oregon in the 1980s finally dropped the last US eugenics law. And along the way, somewhere over 70,000 people were sterilized in the US under these laws. It also began in Germany before the Nazis. And it was, there was so much that was shocking in researching this book. I thought I knew enough about it to write a book in a few weeks, and it took me a year. And some of the hardest research slog that I've had to go through to understand how these strands come together. That eugenics was an incredibly popular idea, so much so that about 6 or 7 years ago, Richard Dawkins, the selfish geneticist, put forward the idea, well, it works for cows and dogs and pigeons, so why can't we do it with humans? And you're going, your subject's biology. I understand why you can't do it with humans, because what you're looking for with a dog or a pigeon or a racehorse is a single trait. You're looking for their appearance. So if they have a pugnacious face, or if they will dig in the ground, terriers. With racehorses, you want them to win races. You want them to be quick. And the problem is that those pugnacious dogs, the bulldogs and the pugs, will have asthma. The King Charles Spaniel is very pretty, but the brain case is not big enough. So you're not breeding a fit animal. And by continuing to breed a species, you'll weaken it because of what's called hybrid vigor by biologists. So Dawkins did actually withdraw his silly comment. But so many famous people, D.H. Lawrence, Winston Churchill, Arthur Balfour, the British Prime Minister, were all massive supporters of this. Kellogg, the guy who gave us cornflakes, poured money into eugenics with the idea that if you sterilized those people that you didn't like the look of, or that who were getting in the way in some way, then you'd be able to make this change. Now, again, the Nazis proved this wrong. They either killed or sterilized 250,000 schizophrenics. And statistics show that in Mannheim, Germany, they have a much higher rate of schizophrenia than in 10 countries that were tested against it. So even, if we put aside the horrors of this and accept that we're looking at Nazi science, it doesn't work. And I do get into the amount of genes you have to be playing with, which is something like 4,000, to actually change, to affect intelligence and mentality, cognition. So these pseudoscientific ideas, I quote D.H. Lawrence saying how happy he would be to take the poor people off the streets and they could have them at Crystal Palace and euthanize them. Incredible that people of significant intellect were lured into this trap. More so, and for me, I think the most shocking thing about the book was realizing that without the Protestant churches, this is going to make me popular, without the 28 Protestant churches in the Reich, this program would not have gone ahead. That the In fact, the Catholic Church, who had actually, through the Catholic Workers' Party, helped to put Hitler into power, so I'm not going to forgive them. They did nothing about the Warsaw Ghetto, and they helped a lot of war criminals to escape after the war. So I'm not going to give them a pass, but they did stand up against eugenics, both in the US and in Germany. All 28 of the Protestant confessions had to admit that Jesus was not Jewish, he was a Galilean Aryan, and that his message was to end Judaism. And as you know, Joe, this is prefigured in the works of Martin Luther, who said that Jews should be hung 7 times higher than other criminals. So it pulled together many strands. Blavatsky picked up an idea that it starts in the late 18th century. A Welsh guy worked out, I think it was numbers in 3 different European languages. And he said, oh, they sound the same. I wonder if there's a common origin. And he started looking for what would be called Indo-European. In Germany, it was called Indo-German, or Aryan. And this is, it's a Sanskrit word for Iranian. It comes from the same place as Iranian, as you say, and it means the nobility, the aristocracy. This is then perverted by a French count, Arthur de Gobineau, who we read was fearful that he had a black slave in his own ancestry. And the same was true for his wife. And this gave him this sort of complex. He grabbed the word Aryan and said it means noble people like me, not peasants like the rest of you. And his idea was that it was Vikings, particularly the Normans, who invaded and come to England under William the Conqueror, William the Bastard, as he was known at the time, and had gone to Sicily under Roger and Robert. And that they had blue blood. They were a distinct and separate race. Gobineau's most famous disciple was Richard Wagner, who actually traveled with Gobineau, though we find that he never sacked his Jewish concertmaster, despite his anti-Semitism. He was the best concertmaster he could get, and he would actually have dinner with this guy, and very strange. Gobineau's ideas are then picked up by a state senator, state congressman. He served as a representative and as a senator, called Ignatius Loyola Donnelly, which I think tells us what his religious background was, probably. And he was actually quite a good guy. He was for votes for women. He objected when funds were taken from the Freedmen's Bureau 10 years after the Civil War. He thought that freedmen, former slaves, should be given something in return for what had been done to them. He also joined in on the debate about who wrote Shakespeare, and put forward some very strange ideas about that. He believed it was Francis Bacon. It wasn't. And he wrote about the Viking gods being some kind of reality, but he wrote a book called, I think it's called Atlantis, the Lost Continent.
Yes.
And I'm actually reading a novel of his called Caesar's Column, which is a futuristic dystopian novel. And in this book, he puts forward the idea that the Atlantis was real, that the stories told by Plato, which are about somewhere that it existed, I think meant to have existed 7,000 years before Plato. There's no other mention other than, I think Herodotus mentions it once. There are 2 of Plato's dialogues where he tells us about a story told to him by an Egyptian priest who says, you Athenians, 7,000 years ago, fought a war with the people of Atlantis. And there we get the invention of Atlantis. And it lies dormant until the 19th century.
Yeah, but one thing, even in reading Plato, you get the idea that he, in the dialogue, he heard it from someone who heard it from someone who heard it from someone. So it's like whisper down the trail, and that's how he puts it. So I mean, that should immediately alert the reader that this isn't real history.
Yeah,
this is storytelling.
Like my dad told me that he has this story from Sumeria that's been passed down from mouth to mouth for the last 7,000 years. It's really unlikely. There is a great documentary which I reference in the book where this Greek guy does this wonderful job of saying, well, maybe it was this. And he actually gives you the possibility. Of course, there was no Athenian or Attic civilization 7,000 years before Plato. There just wasn't. But there may well have been a West African civilization that was fighting war at that time. Yeah. And there are some really interesting marks to it. What it says, however, is that the Aryans, these people, because Donnelly calls them Aryans, were actually black, which kind of goes against where Hitler was trying to take us. So it's a fairy story with not one shred of proof. Mm-hmm. Donnelly then tells the story, and he tells us that the Aryans are red-headed people who live in Scotland and Ireland. Now, he publishes in 1882. Madame Blavatsky publishes the completely unreadable, and I say that two people have written in my comments. They have read it, but I don't know what's wrong with them. 1,500 pages regurgitated, where she tells us that intelligent life began in an intangible form on this planet between 200 and 300 million years ago. And that as these beings, the first root race, became more sinful, they solidified. And by the fifth root race, and at the end of the fifth root race, we get the Aryans. Now, she is anti-Semitic, but she's not talking about killing Jews. She posits that there was a yellow Adam and a red Adam, and that we come from these different Adams. She puts forward the idea that there was a 1,000,000-year-long aerial war fought within these civilizations, which is an unbelievable thought. A war for 1,000,000 years. They didn't have any aeroplanes because, of course, when she was writing in 1888, the Wright brothers hadn't done their flight. So it was all dirigibles. It was all balloons fighting each other. But there's nothing left of 1,000,000 years of war. If you walk the battlefield at Bull Run or Gettysburg or here at Naseby, for civil wars that took 4 years, you will find lead. You will find, if you go to the Somme, you can't fight.
But we also find evidence of dinosaurs from 50, 60 million years ago. So there should be some evidence if there was a war that long. But just to bring this back to the topic on how this relates to Scientology, because you do a comparative occult read between Himmler and Hubbard. And so Hubbard, in his approach, claims that he went into the primordial wisdom at a risk of his own life and channeled, so to speak, OT3 and other mysteries that come out of the etheric universe that him and Crowley were experimenting with at one time. And so I want you to kind of bring this back into the book's central thesis, which is that comparison between Hitler and Himmler and maybe a little bit of Crowley and how his sex magic was able to influence what we understand as Scientology.
Yeah, well, it started for me with a secret bulletin that Hubbard wrote that stated the 5th of May 1980. Of course, he died in 1986. 2 years after his death, the highest level of Scientology, the level that had been promised from its very beginnings in February 1952, when he lost Dianetics and had to make something else up, he promised that you would be able to leave your body, travel anywhere in the universe at will, and create effects of a magical nature. So, if you felt like blowing a planet up, you'd be able to do that. Now, this was always what was promised in Scientology, still is promised in Scientology. You will be able to be at cause, as he put it, over matter, energy, space, and time, both mental and physical. So you'll be a magician. You'll be able to perform magic. Now, in this fascinating bulletin, which was only released for 1 week to a handful of people who by then had paid about $500,000 to get to this, pinnacle and zenith and nadir of Scientology. This first bulletin basically says, okay, I'm with Lucifer, which is another word, of course, for Satan, and the Antichrist, and the whole purpose of Scientology, and this is not said anywhere else to Scientologists, we were not told this, the whole purpose of Scientology is to stop the second coming of Christ. And then it says, I had an inkling of this material in 1945. And you kind of go, that's when he met Jack Parsons, their Crowley acolyte, with whom in 1946, they tried to incarnate the Antichrist, which they call Babylon, to bring about Armageddon and the war, where he was hoping they could stop the return of Christ. They could stop, and Satan would rule. And you kind of go, maybe South Park is the right place to be actually discussing these philosophical ideas.
You have a good point.
Yeah. So there was so much that was just amazing in writing this book. I've been around Scientology 50 years, and it's 42 years since I left, and I've gone deeply into the biography of Ron Hubbard, very deeply. My book was used by Russell Miller to write his wonderful biography of Hubbard, a good book, Barefaced Messiah, which is also the best title a book's ever had. And I was his only paid researcher through the 18 months of doing that from the beginning, and I was his expert witness in court. So I'm deeply familiar with the biography of Hubbard, with his Magick. I've written a lot about it. I've spoken a lot about it. So it was amazing to find, hang on a minute, there's a man in common between the development of Scientology and the Aryan race theory as it got to the Nazis. And this is a close friend of Blavatsky's called Dr. Franz Hartmann. And there's a Hartmann Society. It started up quite recently. And I wrote to them along the way and I said, look, I've been through 4 of Hartmann's books and he seems like a relatively decent human being. How come it is that he was a member of the List Society, which is where the Nazis got the Aryan race theory from? And how come he was a founder of the Ordo Templi Orientis, the sex magic group that Aleister Crowley would later come to head, and which is the basis of Scientology? All Hubbard did was he rebranded, there we are. He rebranded Thelema, this idea of the will in Crowley, and called it intention. And he took the idea of magic and gave us new words for it and said, you'll be able to do these things. I have scientifically researched this. This guy Hartmann is a confluence. And as I say, I wrote to the Hartmann Society and the answer I got was, we're not the right people. You need to talk to somebody else. And you've got the wrong email address. I said, this is the email address of the Hartmann Society. And they referred me to somebody else and he didn't reply. And I would have been interested to find out. Hartmann was a fascinating character. Whether he was actually a medical doctor or not, we're not sure. But he did perform eye surgery on people for 12 years in Colorado before becoming, a head of one of the Theosophical Societies for Madame Blavatsky. Crowley's ideas, the Beast 666, a fairly direct connection. Somebody tried to argue with me that Crowley wasn't really an anti-Christian. You're going, he called himself the Beast 666, if you looked at what that means, on whom Babylon will ride when she comes to oppose Jehovah. That confluence of ideas becomes sex magic, which Hubbard practiced. The 2 ceremonies or set of ceremonies that he practiced with Jack Parsons in January to March 1946 are sex magic ceremonies. They are the 8th and final ceremony of the Ordo Templi Orientis, the Order of Eastern Templars, one of the many Templar societies, which would, of course, also lead to the Nazis, and which Himmler was very keen on. And Himmler was, of course, the second most powerful man in the Third Reich. He had 1.25 million troops, the Waffen and Allgemeine SS, under his direct control.
John, were you ever able to prove that Himmler was a member of the OTO, or any other high-level ranking Nazis were members of the OTO? Because I know they banned it. There was the Action Hess or whatever at one point where they banned all the secret societies.
Yeah, and in fact, before the Hess action, which is 1941, Hitler in 1935 had banned all occult societies, including the Anthroposophists. No, Himmler, as far as I can tell, did not belong to any occult society. However, he ran an occult society. At Wewelsburg Schloss, he would bring SS officers and they would study yoga, they would study meditation, they would study his interpretations of Wotanism, which is still with us. Of course, in the neo-Nazi movement, you have Odinists or Wotanists who believe that they are following an ancient Viking religion, which of course they aren't, because one of the defects of the Viking religion was that they didn't leave any record of it. So it's only around about 1000, year 1000, that we have the Edda from Iceland, the prose and the poetic Edda, which are reflections upon what used to be, as far as they can tell, beliefs of Viking, Danish societies. So, but Hans Frank, who was the Governor General of Poland, where all of the death camps were, Rudolf Hess, the deputy leader of the party, they were members. They were on the edge of the Toolgesellschaft, the Tool Society, which was an occult society, and a part of a front group for another order called the Germanen Orden, which was, and the groups through which the List Society was informed by Theosophy. So you have this very clear line, and it happens in a pretty short period of time. The Nazi Party, the National Socialist Deutsches Arbeiter Party, was formed within the Tool Society by people who were communicants of that society. Now, this has maybe been pushed a little too far. There is the idea, Eric Kurlander is probably the current academic expert, because Goodrich Clark is sadly no longer with us. And Goodrich Clark,
sorry to interrupt, but I just restreamed my interview with Kurlander. So it was Hitler's Monsters is the name of his book. Yeah. So sorry to interrupt.
No, absolutely. It's absolutely relevant, and it's a very good book. But there are a couple of ideas that I think have been stretched. And the first is where, if you look to Wikipedia on the subject of Nazi occultism, it very confidently tells you that Goodrich Clark showed that Frank and Hess and others were members of the Toolgesellschaft. I said they were communicants. There is no evidence of membership. We know they went to meetings, and we know that the Nazi Party was formed, out of one of those meetings. But the claim that Kurlander makes, and he's careful about it, he's a very good scholar, is about Ernst Schertl. And the idea, I have it somewhere here, who knows where. Ernst Schertl's book, Magick, which I reference in my own book, was found in Hitler's library. And there are 60 marked passages in it. It's an extraordinarily interesting book. I don't have any interest whatsoever in the occult. I had to struggle my way through Aleister Crowley's awful books to see how they related to Scientology. So it's not one of my interests. It's never been one of my pastimes to dress up in black robes and make candles out of babies or anything like that. I just didn't fancy it. Never done it. But there's this idea that because this book was in Hitler's library and because it's annotated, therefore Hitler was involved with the occult. And one of the things I'm at pains to point out is that there is no evidence. It's a signed copy. Schertl himself signed it, and it's an incredible book because it talks about how the imagination can be manipulated so that people think things are real. So, and you can see that Hitler understood the principles in it, but there is nothing to say that the marks were made by Hitler in the book, let alone anything else. And of course, it's after his ascension to power. The book's published, it gets into the library in 1934, and he took power in January 33. Hitler does not seem, as yet, the evidence may change something, but as yet I can't find anything that connects Hitler. Himmler, Heydrich, and a whole set of other Nazis are deeply committed to Wotanism, to this idea of overthrowing, and Hitler did talk about overthrowing the Christian church, but I think realized that he wasn't powerful enough to do that. And so instead they created a Reichsbishop who was over the 28 confessions, one of which was the confessing church, the Nazi church. But the other 27 were the Protestant churches of Germany. And they were sort of brought to heel so that they acted in accord with Hitler's wishes.
Jon, there's something interesting in reading your book and another book I read on Russian cosmists. Cosmism is a big movement since the 19th century. Seems to be a correlation going on in these occult fascist endeavors between occult science and rocket science. Parsons was a rocket scientist, and he had some chops in terms of the technology behind that. The early cosmists, following Fedorov in Russia, were some of the earliest promoters of rocket science, like Vernadsky. So this idea converges somewhat in the title I gave my review, which is Pee-wee Fascism, which is what a critic of the I Am activity that was founded by the Ballards called the Ballards movement Pee-wee Fascism. And so I see Scientology as another version, a small version of fascist movement without an army. So that's what sets groups like that apart from, say,
it does have a
Nazi
navy,
Germany.
of course.
Well, yeah, it did have a navy. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
And its own intelligence service, right? Its own intelligence. I think
yeah.
you write about that, Jon. Yeah.
Hundreds
and it had navy uniforms too, which is
still does,
more important, I guess. So this idea of rocket science, of not only power to blow things up, but power to get off the earth, goes very much in line with occult science in the sense that you can somehow create a superhuman being that will ascend, like Jesus ascended from this planet and live forever. The Thetan, the oversoul, the Übermensch, whatever you want to call this thing. So there's this fascinating correlation between the sciences on one hand. What drives us to want to go to other planets? I mean, what the hell do we want to do up there? We didn't evolve on Mars. We're not going to do well on Mars. I don't care how many human beings you put there. It doesn't make any sense. But we're fascinated with getting off this planet, either by spiritually ascending or through some rocket. And some of the science, is looking at the complexity of this. Is it all possible? Like at the Santa Fe Institute, for instance. People take this seriously, and there's some deep inner human drive, I think, to conquer death before we die. And Ernst Becker wrote about it in The Denial of Death. We just continually do this. And I think that Scientology and a lot of these cults are based on this way of reformulating human behavior to defeat death. And they invite a lot of people into their midst because guess what? We all dream about doing that somehow. Or most of us do, unless we're committed atheists, which is a very small percentage of the human race. And I often wonder about atheists. Are they really honest about this? It's just a human urge to survive, and we extend it to after death. And I think that a lot of this occultism that we come across is an invitation to transcend normal human power and to become superhuman, kind of like a Harry Potter universe, or that type of dream we continue to have. The difference, I think, is that Scientology wants us to take their magic seriously. Just like the group I was in, Church Universal and Triumphant, the I Am movement, wanted us to take word magic seriously, that you could decree a thing and it would happen. So did you covered some of that in your book as well. Hubbard's whole approach to therapy which was to end up spiritualizing the human being into a thetan. Could you talk about that a little bit more? Because it comes out of this idea of magic that you talk about in the book.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, yes, that the whole Dianetics movement, starting in 1950, there were an awful lot of people who came from the sciences, particularly people who were electronic engineers. I met and interviewed, a number of people who were part of the origins of the movement. They were avid readers of astounding science fiction, and there were many rocket scientists and other people who were reading astounding science fiction. And as you say, there is this urge. Neil deGrasse Tyson very sensibly said, if Elon Musk was willing to spend the money it would take to terraform Mars so it could be inhabited, we could solve all the problems of the Earth, because that's how much it's going to cost. On the other hand, there are those of us who'd love to see Elon Musk go to Mars.
Oh, yeah.
It would definitely be good for the human race, I think. And there's another connection there, of course. Nikola Tesla was a fairly much a spiritualist Looney Tune, and gave his name to a brand of car. So I years ago, I read the transcript of the Clearwater hearings in May 1982 in Clearwater, Florida. And there was a man called Brown McKee who had been involved with Scientology for 24 years and had just left after he discovered that they really couldn't cure cancer, despite Hubbard's claims to that effect. And his wife was suffering from cancer. And he testified very bravely. And he said, I knew that he was a physicist, and he said, I knew what Hubbard was saying about physics was complete nonsense, but I was fascinated by what he said about Buddhism. And I had to laugh because I came from Buddhism into Scientology, and I knew what Hubbard was saying about Buddhism was nonsense, but I was fascinated by the scientific claims he was making. And I think those two worlds are often sort of divided, that people who have studied in the humanities, and read philosophy, will have a less simplistic view of the world than people who studied in the sciences, in the pure sciences. And so there is this longing. I also think that the essential narcissism of human beings is the belief that they'll live forever. That, whatever else we say, this idea that I'm going to go to heaven because I'm a good boy, and you're going to go to hell because you aren't. Or I'm going to be reincarnated. And that gets twisted in Scientology and other New Age cults. Of course, to the Hindus and the Buddhists, it's called the fear of the eternal return, reincarnation. Yeah. You're trying to get off the wheel of suffering. Whereas Scientologists are like, I'll do it in my next lifetime, which may be why the suicide rate in Scientology is about 10 times what it is in the normal population. Because they say, oh, well, I've screwed it up. I'll just kill myself and come back another time. Don't think it works that way. So yeah, the fear of death, the unwillingness to accept the reality of the eternal now, the reality of, living to the fullest now, with the idea that you somehow, add some points to the ledger so you'll have a better rebirth or what have you.
Yeah. Okay. One more thing I want to get in about your book, because I know all these topics can meander into hours of conversation, as we
hopefully will.
Yes, maybe longer in other groups following up on this. But
well, you and I have been talking about it for 4 decades.
I know, it's just doesn't stop, does it? I thought it would stop for me when I left the cult, but it's gotten worse. And that's since 1980. So part of your title mentions space aliens. So I want you to clarify that. And what I'm getting into is Captain Bill and the Markabians. Tell us about that a little bit, because this is a spinoff from Scientology itself, the core of it, which a lot of people don't really understand. And I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, there may well be more people involved with the independent Scientology movements than the mother cult now. And Captain Bill created what he called the free zone, which is the accepted term among independents for what they do. Now, Bill was an incredible character. He was a civil engineer. He was 6'4" and rode a Harley Davidson. I came to know him very well. And he got ship's papers So he was the captain of Hubbard's cattle ferry, the Apollo, and absolutely glued to L. Ron Hubbard. He loved L. Ron Hubbard. I mean, he really loved L. Ron Hubbard. And in 1982, having been promoted, Hubbard called himself the Commodore, as of course did Vanderbilt, Cornelius Vanderbilt, but I don't think there's any point in mentioning that, so I won't. Hubbard called himself the Commodore. His wife, Mary Sue, who went to prison for a year for running the intelligence agency, was the Deputy Commodore, and Captain Bill was the second Deputy Commodore. So he was the highest ranking member of the Sea Organization. He was inducted into the Commodore's Messenger Organization. Only he and one other adult were ever allowed to join this group, a man called Norman Starkey. And then he was thrown out in 1982. And he freaked out. I mean, I say I got to know him quite well through 1984. And he said he went to his friend Mike Baker Rogers' house in Spain and said, "Have you got a small room I could be in?" And Mike said, "Yeah." And he said, "It's not small enough. Have you got a wardrobe?" And Bill sat shivering in a wardrobe for some days before he could finally, because the shock of this was his whole life serving Ron Hubbard, and he'd been thrown out. So he decided that Hubbard must be dead and on the mothership, and he started to receive telepathic messages, as of course you do. And he wrote them down and published them and called them Sector Operations Bulletins, or SOBs, slightly unfortunate initialism. And these were messages from L. Ron L. Ray, the former identity of the underlying identity of L. Ron Hubbard, about what was happening in the universe. And this is some of the craziest stuff I have ever seen. At the time, in fact, Hubbard was not on the mothership. He was in Creston, just outside San Luis Obispo, on his ranch there. So maybe the messages were bouncing off a star or something, and that's why Bill got confused. But these things were all signed Astar Parmegian when Bill had written them down. They were written in something almost indistinguishable from Hubbard's handwriting. I did check, and the capital A's were the only difference. So Bill had completely absorbed Hubbard and acted this thing out. He set up this whole independent network of Scientology, and I'd read all the sector operations bulletins, and as I was leaving Scientology, I was appointed the chairman of the Operating Thetan Committee UK by Captain Bill, with no idea who he was or what that was. And I was at the centre of the independent movement. Yes, he might be a blue chicken. Yeah, it's a good point. I was at the centre of the independent movement in the UK for a few months in 1983, and then went, this guy's a liar and this is nonsense. Having been a devoted believer for 9 years, it's just like, he's a liar. He keeps contradicting himself. And then, digging into his past, he didn't do any of the things he claims. Bill once told me that he'd been in the room twice when Hubbard had done something that would put anybody off Scientology. And I spent 8 months trying to, because he came to live in East Grinstead where I was living with a friend of mine. I spent 8 months trying to tease out of him what these two things were, and he never told me. The sad story is that at the age of 58, Bill died. He had a tumor in his throat, and he refused to have a tracheotomy. So he strangled to death because he was sure that he could use his spiritual powers as devised, while working closely with Ron Hubbard. He was sure he could use his powers to overcome this thing. So it led to his death. Very premature death. One of the things, I print the whole of one of the sector operations bulletins, and I was like, can I really, thrust this upon my readers, the whole of the thing? But it's so bizarre that it shows you the internal workings of a mind that's completely infested with these ideas. And there's a point where he talks about this OT3 incident, which the South Park episode about Tom Cruise has. This is what Scientologists really believe, and that is the Operating Thetan 3, the Wall of Fire episode. And he says, basically, he relates it to the Chicxulub incident, the asteroid that hit in the what is now called the Gulf of America some time ago. And it's dated through iridium layers, which are completely datable through radio dating, radioactive dating. And it dates to 66 million years ago. It's the last great extinction, got the dinosaurs. And Bill explains in this sector operations bulletin that they've got it wrong, dating the iridium layer, because Ron Hubbard dated it at 75 million years ago using his e-meter. And that thought that it's a Wheatstone bridge, it's nothing elaborate. It tells you how you feel. It doesn't tell you whether you have the truth or not. It tells you how you feel. It's a part of the police polygraph, long since discredited. The whole idea of lie detection, long since discredited. A wonderful book called Tremors in the Blood, which gives a very good history of polygraphs and says that even the people who invented them didn't believe they worked. But nonetheless, it was important for me because it showed that the method of verification used by Madame Blavatsky, Aleister Crowley, Carl Gustav Jung, or L. Ron Hubbard is, does that seem right to me? And if it seems right to you, it's the truth. That's their research. That's their way of doing science.
Yeah, that's John, just to point out, that's one of the most common arguments I've gotten in interacting with cult members doing interventions is that, well, I know it's true because I experienced it as true.
Yeah.
It's like a mantra almost. And, and so I slowly and carefully try to bring about the fact that experience is only the beginning of inquiry.
Yes.
And you can also learn from vicarious experience from other things and people and from history and from experimentation and from
instruction manuals.
Yeah, in other words, shoring up the evidence of your experience. But it's like full stop. My experience told me it's true, therefore it's true. And that's where the problem begins when people tumble down these rabbit holes, including Hubbard.
Absolutely. And I mean, one of the common pieces of advice, I've heard it from a number of cult experts, is trust your intuition. And you're kind of going, no, test your intuition.
Yes.
So we can be so wrong. Hubbard even admitted that there's a book called Dianetics, the Evolution of a Science, which is a reworking of an article from, I think, 1949. And in there, Hubbard talks about his research methods, and he says he used automatic writing, what we call channeling or transmediumship. And you're kind of going, as a scientific method of inquiry, I'm not really too sure that's one of the better ones.
It's interesting. Blavatsky used the same technique when she wrote The Secret Doctrine. She just, according to, her witnesses that were around her at the time, she would just stay up all night, and these pages would fly off of her desk and grammatically impure and corrupted, but she also had a somewhat photographic memory where she had about 100 books that she would quote from, not necessarily always looking things up. Colonel Olcott wrote about this in old diary leaves. He was with her the whole time when she was doing this, writing this stuff. But she more or less channeled, this information. And so it came from her masters, 5 of them, mainly helping her along. 4 of which were totally imaginary, one of which, the Comte de Saint-Germain, was quite a charlatan during his day. But so, all of that aside, this form of immediate experience coming into the mind from the intuition, from other worlds, from the Akashic records, which is supposed to be this eternal library that Blavatsky made up from a Sanskrit word meaning sky, and she translated into Akasha as the font of information of somehow. But in any case, that what you bring up, I think, is very true about almost all of these cult leaders, is they want people to believe that they're in touch with some kind of gnosis, that they grok things immediately and purely, and that you should listen to them because they claim that they do. So that's basically what Hubbard did, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, William James, who's certainly one of the founders of modern psychology, as well as the founder of both the British and American Societies for Psychical Research. There's a great book called Ghost Hunters by Deborah Blum about that, which is really, she's amazing, really something. The Poisoner's Handbook by her is also very good. But James put forward the idea of noesis, which is the feelings of knowing. That a lot of what we believe is because we feel it's right. And being able to test it, if you poke people and ask them for evidence, friend John Hunter wrote an excellent book called Manufacturing Mania. Now, he experienced bipolar disorder. He had a manic episode in, I think, 2003, and thought he was Jesus, and was absolutely high for months and months, and then crashed. And his training was all in business and finance, but he decided he'd better find out about bipolar disorder. And he became an expert on the subject. He has a PhD. And round about 2010, his boss at work said, "Oh, you've got to go onto this training," which I think was the Forum. I think it was, Landmark Trust, what used to be called Earhart Seminar Training. But I don't think he wants to be sued by them, so he doesn't generally tend to say that's who it was. And he looked at their list of transformations, what you were going to achieve by doing this large group awareness training. Tony Robbins, LifeSpring, there are lots of them out there. And he looked at the transformations and he said, these are the symptoms of hypomania, heightened emotionality, the stage just before you flip into the madness of mania. And he then researched that and has written this great book about how dopamine is suppressed in the brain by the stress that's put on you in these trainings for 2 or 3 days and then released. And so you have a hypomanic or even manic incident. Some people have had to be committed after going into one of these things. And that is an aspect of just about all dangerous cult groups, that they are able to give you a euphoric experience, a sense of a peak experience, but using actually very simple techniques. I mean,
Robert Lifton called it mystical manipulation, where the owners of the group or whatever, they know what's going to happen to most of the people, or a lot of the people, during these exercises, this experiential amusement park that they put people through for a weekend or a week. And you can almost predict that people are going to have these powerful experiences that are essentially induced. They're not normal and not natural.
It's interesting that you mentioned Tony Robbins, because I talked about him last night. I did a 3-hour stream and just showed the kind of application of hypnosis going all the way back to some of the earlier practitioners. But these guys all had an interest in hypnosis. In your book, John, you talk about Blavatsky, Crowley, maybe even Hitler. All are interested in these kind of like mesmerism and things like that. And definitely Hubbard too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a paper called Never Believe a Hypnotist, which is a quotation from Ron Hubbard, who admitted he was a hypnotist. And in the paper, I show that he explained what Scientology was going to be, and that the techniques that are used in Scientology is even one that's very direct. In his first text, Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, which they still sell, still promote, and got back into the bestseller lists in the 1990s. He says that as the person is going into reverie, which is a hypnotist term for light trance, as they're going into reverie, you will see their eyelids flickering. And a year later, in a book called Science of Survival, Hubbard cancelled this method because it's hypnotic, very clearly. Then in 1977, they reintroduced it, and they've used it ever since. So there is no doubt they're using these methods. I think part of our problem is that there are lots of very simple physiological ways to make people feel high. Mindfulness, which is certainly occult, and John Kabat-Zinn and Daniel Goleman should be ashamed of himself for supporting this. Now, what they call mindfulness is the technique Zazen. I learned Zazen in a Zen monastery when I was 18 years old, before getting involved with Scientology. And I was a practitioner for a year. So I recognize the technique they're using and where it comes from. The problem is that if you look at where that technique's been applied, so all of the schools of Zen Buddhism, the Soto, the Yobaku, and the Rinzai schools have all apologized for training the Japanese Imperial Army. And where Jon Kabat-Zinn and Daniel Goleman tell you all you have to do is stare at things and you'll become compassionate. You'll get blissed out, you'll become compassionate, your anxiety will go away, you'll become compassionate. Well, no, the Japanese army, probably the least compassionate people the world has ever seen. 40% of prisoners of war died in Japanese custody. The Nanjing massacre, they killed perhaps 400,000 civilians. And the Zen master who the general looked up to wrote to him and congratulated him on bringing true Zen to China. So this idea that this technique, what actually happens when you stare at things is called the Ganzfeld effect. You will start to hallucinate because there's not enough information coming into your mind to process. So the sensitivity goes up. And you'll then have the normal euphoric hypnotic state. There are lots of ways of doing this. Anything repetitious, mimicry, copying somebody, pasting.
You can repeat affirmations, for instance.
Yeah.
Is a form of autosuggestion. Yeah. Which I want to bring up here again. We mentioned theosophy as being sort of the godmother of a lot of the nonsense going on in fringe groups and
yes,
and fringe thinking, but also new thought is what I discovered in my own research when I emerged from the cult of
and Christian Science
and the Church Universal. Yeah, and new thought is based in mesmerism. Again, so is hypnosis. And so the idea of autosuggestion is suggesting that you can put on the mind of Christ as Christian Science does. And if you could put on the mind of Christ through self-suggestion, you will cure yourself of weakness, of illness, of even death. This is something that's taught in Mary Baker Eddy's books. And a lot of the New Thought movement groups, including the one Trump's family belonged to under Norman Vincent Peale.
Norman Vincent Peale, yeah.
Has infected the way millions of Americans behave. In fact, I think it's Alan Bloom. He called it the American religion, the idea of new thought, that we all have this idea of positive thinking, that we can speak things into existence. We can manifest things, as the New Age Wiccans like to say. We can decree a thing and it shall become what we decree it to be. The entire Ramtha cult movement is based on this idea that you can speak things into being or imagine them into being.
The secret, the law of attraction.
The secret is based on that. The Course in Miracles is all
Course in Miracles is self-hypnosis.
It's pure new thought. It's pure new thought. So we're kind of infected by this metaphysical virus. That's
also an MK Ultra project, by the way. Course in Miracles.
Yes, it was. Yeah. And it always fails. One of the things I'd like to say that got me out of the cult back in 1980 was, after all this decreeing and trying to manifest and all of this going on and watching people get pasty-faced and weak around me in the cult, and having diseases like everybody else, in fact, worse. All of this effort could not even warm up a cup of tea for me, let alone, heal anything or change the weather or whatever they were claiming it to do. So, and the corollary to that is, in many of my cases, people say, well, you don't believe in the power of the mind? You don't believe in all that? I go, well, it's not that I don't believe. I don't see any evidence for what you're saying. I have come out publicly against some of the most powerful exponents of decreeing and manifesting and powers of the mind, including Satya Sai Baba, Elizabeth Clare Prophet. And I know from inside information from ex-members, hundreds of people have decreed to annihilate my spirit.
Yeah, I don't blame them, Joe, because
no.
You're a troublemaker. So, what can I say?
I am 78 years old right now, and I don't take pills. And I'm just wondering, if that was happening, even if it was evil, where's the power? Where's the evidence for the power if it was directed at me? So there's two solutions to that. One is doesn't exist. The other one is I have a hell of a powerful guardian angel. So take your pick.
I go for the second one. It's because
it's
I'm
got
your guardian
it's got
angel,
wings, you know, and it. So.
Yeah, I mean, in Scientology, when they're interviewed, Scientologists and probably members of other groups will say that they can move clouds, they can make dust devils appear if you're in that kind of environment, and they can change traffic lights, which in South Africa are called robots for some reason. These are the things they can do. So I started at talks doing this thing where I get a little bit of tinfoil, put it on the lectern or the desk or what have you in front of me, and I say, if this moves 1 inch during the talk, I will believe that there are magical powers. And I'm sad to say it never did. So yeah, as you say, I mean, how could I possibly still be talking about Scientology 42 years later if they've got thousands of these super beings who could at least strike me dumb? It hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, and at this point,
tried,
at this point, if I drop dead tomorrow, it's too late. They had their shot.
Yeah,
you know, they had their shot for 40 years.
Stop projecting those horrid thoughts at us. Yeah, I tell you, I'm 70 years old. I'm happier now than I've ever been since I was about 4 years old, and my health is ridiculously good. Whereas in Scientology, one of the investigations that I did alongside some independent Scientologists who were interested in this back in the late 80s, mid 80s, we were surprised at how many Scientologists had died of cancer. And as I mentioned Brown McKee before, and he said that when he took his wife who had cancer to the Florida headquarters of Scientology, they said, oh, we can't do anything about that. Go to the Hoxie clinic or, you know, one of these Mexican clinics. And he said, we went into the waiting room at this clinic and it was full of Scientology operating Thetans, people who'd done all of Scientology. And for, you know, the independents who asked me to do this believed that it was because they were doing Scientology wrong that this was happening to them. I came to the conclusion they weren't seeking treatment quickly enough. It was that simple. Right. They'd say, no, I'll be able to, you know, cure it by, you know, my auditing, by getting rid of my body Thetans, which we haven't talked about body Thetans. The idea that really what's wrong with everybody is that they're inhabited by thousands of little beings which are acting against them.
Right, and you have to do auditing to get them out. So you're almost like, it's like Scientology saying you're demon possessed or something. Is that too much of a stretch? Yeah, no, yeah.
No, it's exactly and directly that. Dibbooks, Gadons, there are names in every culture for this idea. And for me, it's the most powerful, stupid idea we have is that there's an internal enemy. There's something, the unconscious mind, or, you know, sure, we have unconscious processes, but there's not a little guy sitting there going, I'm going to trip you up. It's just not happening. And whether we call them demons, body Thetans, the unconscious mind, the reactive mind, what have you, it's something that people, I think that once you start believing something, you start doing it to yourself. So nobody had a reactive mind before L. Ron Hubbard came along. And then he taught us how to have a reactive mind, how to think that there was this secret agent.
Suggestion to the people.
Pure and simple. Yeah.
Guys, we are at the hour 15-minute mark. Do you have time for a few questions?
Sure.
Hubbard is an ascended master now. Is he? He said he was source, almost like you said, barefaced Messiah. Didn't he like go to the level beyond next when he left our mortal coil or something like that?
Well, it shuffled off. There are various ideas about this. One was that you have 21 years and you have to come back if you're a member of this organization. He was the head of it, so he should have been back in 2007. So he's absent without leave. The second is that he was going to go off to somewhere else in the galaxy and screw that up, which, you know, who knows. And the third is that he was actually, his ashes were distributed in the Pacific Ocean. And that one I have confirmed. So he's a descended master, not an ascended master.
He's a descended. I like that. That's Jonathan Sebastian. Cheeseburger Nikki says, is the end game of this cycle the implementation of the Luciferian agenda? True? Question mark. You guys want to address that?
You have a go at that, Joe. Tell us if that's the truth.
Well, it's true if you believe it. As most of human nature is, there's this, you know, we live through our useful delusions. In other words, Plato called it the noble lie, and he noticed it, and so have many other thinkers and people notice it, that we need some kind of a social construct in order to maintain our clannishness, our families, our honesty toward one another. We need rules and judgments, but these are all constructs. They're plausibility constructs, as sociology calls them, and they're useful and maybe necessary. I personally don't know if there's some ideal world where a God is influencing prophets and saints or whatever to guide us. All I know is that we believe there are, and sometimes our beliefs are useful and help organize society and keep us thriving in this planet. As far as final answers, I mean, if you look at not the Bhagavad Gita, but the Upanishads, there is no final answer. We just don't know, and you find that in Buddhism, you find that in mystical Christianity, the idea of the cloud of unknowing. We just go into a place where what we call the human brain just can't conceive of that. And apparently the wall is death. No one's come back, as far as we know. And with a lot of stories that people have. There's a lot of stories that people have. And the whole concept of reincarnation is this idea that people can come back. But the Greeks very wisely said that you go through the river of forgetfulness when you reincarnate. You don't remember anything. So all this stories about past lives is real bullshit, even according to ancient Greeks. So,
sorry, Joe.
Yeah. No, but all I'm pointing out here is if you use a little humility, you can say to yourself, there's a limit to what we can know about all this. And some of our projections are useful. And we try to maintain them as churches and clans and cults and businesses and philosophies or whatever. And, the great human debate goes on, but the idea of survival and helping and kind to one another is an idea which hasn't really gone away. It's still there and it's still useful. We shouldn't be cynical about that, but there is, we like to believe that we can name the end game. And what's interesting about the end game, about Revelation, is that every generation comes up with an end game time slot. Like the late great Planet Earth was one of the, by Hal Lindsey from I think the 60s he wrote it, I forget, but it was supposed to end in 1988. And
it did.
Up until
it did.
Yeah, it did. The book's prophecy ended. But
the money's still coming in, though, Joe. The
money's still coming in.
Yeah.
But the point I'm making is that people in every generation, or 2 or 3 times a generation, glom on to these things. Like the Great Harmonic Convergence of 1988 was a big hippie New Age event when the great change of the cycles was supposed to happen, and of course nothing much happened.
I've still got the same cycle that I bought then, still riding it.
So
the Mayan end of the Mayan calendar.
The Mayan calendar was another one.
And so I was writing about the Book of Revelation, and that threw me into the Jewish apocalyptic, the Book of Enoch, the Book of the Secrets of Enoch. There are so many of these things, and you kind of, it made me think about a friend of mine, Commander Mike Gordon, who was an amazing character, and we should do a show about him. But one day he too had the Upanishad idea. We're all part of one living entity, and where that's going, but he called it the Great Living Universe Experiment. And he said, why are we still following all these Bronze Age religions? Now, this came back to me. I'm rereading Robert Graves and Raphael Patai, The Myth of the Book of Genesis, where they take all sorts of commentaries from the early centuries about the Book of Genesis and the variants of the Book of Genesis, and they pull these things together. And there's this beautiful passage where God is pulling down the firmament over the earth, and he decides he will leave the northerly end, which is Toul, by the way, as in Toul Gesellschaft. He decides that he will leave the northern end unpinned, so that if there is a God as great as him, it can demonstrate its greatness by pinning this down. And it made me think about the scale of the world at the time that Genesis was written, somewhere between 900 and 450 BC. And that was the scale of the world, that you could pin the firmament, the heavens, down on the corners of the earth. Now, the Hubble telescope, when it went out, recognized 10,000 galaxies. Now, these galaxies would average 100,000 million suns or stars. Now, the James Webb telescope, and I haven't updated this for a couple of months, but earlier this year had got to 780,000 galaxies. So if we start thinking about a God that created this, that is so far beyond my pay grade. That is, to understand if there is any purpose or any meaning in the universe, I have to look to myself and the people around me. And, you know, in the conclusion with my book, I kind of go, you know, genetics has demonstrated something. We may not be brothers and sisters, but we are all cousins. The whole human race. What's more, our ancestors were black. That's all there is to it. We're all descended from black people, which is fine. And that indeed the most significant differences between us genetically are the colors of our skin, our hair, and our eyes. That there's more variation within ethnic groups than there is between ethnic groups. And that leads us down to this point. And in terms of, you know, what's the meaning of life? It's like, I'm absolutely with Chuang Tzu or Epictetus, the Greek philosopher, which is a kind of Epicurean stoicism. I'm here, it's happening, why worry about it? Might as well have a reasonably good time, maintain my health as best I can, and live for relationships with other people and the joy of being in relationship with other people, the beauty of the natural world. And both Joe and I are painters, so we believe in making things that excite the mind and take us somewhere, rather than kind of going onto a mountaintop and waiting for the mothership to come and get us.
Yeah,
we both did try that as younger people, you know.
But Becker, in his book, The Denial of Death, he ends it with a personal statement. He says the best he thinks he can do is to leave a legacy behind that helps the next generation, the next, you know, to thrive, and something that sweetens the experience of life rather than take away from it.
Amen. This guy, Cheeseburger, hold on. Cheeseburger Nikki, just to answer your question, Blavatsky is definitely a Luciferian, and Nazism is Luciferian in its core. So these cycles that repeat themselves have this kind of Luciferian.
Well, just to be specific, and the Worm at the Core brings this up, which is a follow-up on the Denial of Death. But the Blavatsky's idea was that the serpent Lucifer in the Garden of Eden was actually bringing gnosis, knowledge, to mankind, and bringing them away from the false god, the demiurge, that was trapping them into this material life. Right. So that was the early Gnostic heresy, if you want to call it that, the choice, the way they saw Jesus's teachings. And there were hundreds of variations of whoever this guy Jesus was in interpreting his teachings. And we ended up with St. Athanasius kind of cobbling it together with the four Gospels as our Bible, you know, today. But that took several centuries to
in about 375 AD. Yeah.
Right. And so, you know, the idea that it's a little bit too facile to say that, you know, the serpent Lucifer gave us knowledge. Maybe he did. Maybe there's some truth to this in terms of us losing our innocence as animals and becoming very judgmental human beings. You know, we were even judging whether we should wear clothes or not, according to the Genesis myth. You know, God says, "Who told you you were naked?" Well, I don't know. You know, we just suddenly felt kind of odd looking at each other's genitals, and we covered them up. You know, so that separates us from the animals. You don't see lions putting on diapers or whatever. So, you know, there is a more intelligent way to explore that than just an either or. Blavatsky was totally wrong or right. She had something's partly right, but most of it was bullshit that she came up with.
Yeah, and then the notion of Lucifer in their magazine was called Lucifer. So yes, they were definitely into that.
Mhm.
Their notion of Lucifer is Prometheus,
Right,
the bringer of
Prometheus,
light.
right? The Titan,
And
right?
pushing back way before that, and we now have Sumerian and Babylonian materials which tell us the earlier versions of the Garden of Eden. And so there are cylinder seals from Babylon which show the goddess Asherah, the mother of Jehovah, welcoming Adam and Eve into the garden to eat the fruit, which was not an apple, it was a date, because apples hadn't come from Afghanistan yet. And the serpent is the father god. So, the story is retold according to who the audience are and what you want them to do. And on the point of who we are and what we are in the end of the cycle, as I say, I think our notion of individuality, of permanent separateness, is narcissistic. I think we are, as Becker would probably perhaps agree, threads in a tapestry. Mm-hmm. And that tapestry is humanity, and that tapestry is part of whatever consciousness may be. And the thing is to be a golden thread, to be one of the best, or a strong thread, something that's good, and to give something to future generations. My whole life has been about trying to find logical reasons for the existence of humanity. Because when I was about 17, a friend of mine said, the best thing that could happen for the planet is the extinction of the human race. And for about 2 years, I walked around going, God, you might have a point there. We are really messing things up, aren't we? We're really harming things. And then I went, but we're the only creatures that can mend that mess. So, and beyond that, when you've been to the Blue Mosque in Istanbul or Salisbury Cathedral or wherever, probably not the ballroom at the White House, but when you've been to Gothic cathedrals, when you've seen Velázquez's crucifixion, or they're stunning. The things that Mahler's symphony. It's the things that we have been able, Jimi Hendrix, the things we've been able to do that justify the reality. And if we look back to the biblical idea and say, Maimonides, in the Guide of the Perplexed, around about before 1100, starts out by saying it is a mistake to believe that when Genesis says God is created in the image, man is created in the image of God, as the blasphemous painting in the Vatican has it, it's not in his physical image. It is that man has imagination, that we can conceive and think of things which the other 5 to 25 million species can't. The fact that we spend our time, playing video games and, eating ice cream and McDonald's is not necessarily, the best use of that imagination. But when you look at what has been achieved and what can be achieved, what a wonderful thing to have life, to not have been born a rock, to actually be able to have these conjectures and these thoughts.
Thank you.
Yeah, somebody asked there about how many independent Scientologists.
Yeah, let's go back to that. We've got about 4 or 5 more questions, guys. So let's try to roll through them.
In 1993, a friend and I listed 200 groups that had splintered from Scientology by that time. There must be 200 more. And some of them are like Darfried John or Ekankar or Est, that you can't even necessarily see at first that they are direct rip-offs of Scientology. So it's kind of intermingled into the culture now, along with Norman Vincent Peale. The fact that we've got a devotee of Norman Vincent Peale and positive thinking in the White House is just terrifying.
Gotcha. And there's a lot of front groups. Scientology used to have a ton of front groups. I don't know if they still do, but almost like the CIA.
Citizens Commission on Human Rights, for example, which I know a good friend of mine who I've worked with some years. She, at 11 years old, complained about the abuse she was suffering from her Scientologist stepfather. And she was persuaded to withdraw her police report by the Citizens Commission on Human Rights. So, yeah, and they had Narconon and Criminon, all sorts of things.
And they influenced other groups. There was like a big legal battle. I think it was a Cult Information Network or something like that, where they...
Cult Awareness Network.
Cult Awareness, thank you.
They
Cult
brought
Awareness.
54 suits. I was on the periphery of those suits. 53 of them failed. And then, what's his name? The deprogrammer who... Rick Ross. He lost a case where he'd kidnapped somebody. And in losing that case, the Cult Awareness Network became the property of Scientology that ran it for some years after that. And you'd ring up and they'd tell you about cults.
Yeah, the Scientology lawyers, they deposed me, to question me before that last lawsuit against. I spent about 8 hours answering their questions, and was
that Kendrick Moxon?
It was Moxon, yeah.
I had some amusing times with him.
Here's another question. Wally Tang says, "Where would you put Scientology in the realm of cybernetics?" Either of you two want to answer that?
Well, Hubbard borrowed the netics to add to Diana, the name of his goddess, to make Dianetics, but I don't think there is a relationship directly.
Okay, gotcha. Huggy Bear asks, any relation to movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR? I don't know. You guys want to answer?
Not that's a derivative of Ericksonian hypnotism. Shapiro studied. In fact, Steve Hassan was there at the same time she was. And you can pretty much use any straightforward hypnotic method to get somebody to briefly get past the panic and stress they feel. But EMDR, I'm still with Margaret Singer on that it's not a solution. It's a way of calming things down so that you can then possibly do something good.
Yes, I've looked into it too. EMDR. I mean, you could get someone to squeeze a soft ball for 10 minutes to get the same effect if you're a therapist. I mean, this is just overvaluing a technique. Is all EMDR is, in my view.
And it's also a friend of mine trained in it, who is a highly qualified therapist with a long practice behind her, and she was shocked. And firstly, that you have to renew your license for $500 every year. And secondly, that at the end of the course, they were all told, go and ask one of your clients if you can video a session for your records. And then at the end of the session, ask if you can share it. And so that's just ethically improper. No two ways.
Yeah.
Jonathan Sebastian asks, Gnosticism seems to be the philosophical, theological glue to all of these cults. Thoughts? Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the question, I think, is too simplistic. Yeah. Gnosticism is just an umbrella term for a way of thinking. In other words, direct knowing of the truth. We use Gnosticism, every single one of us, to get through life all day long. You know, we just do. And so, but the Gnostics turned these ideas of how we intuit and how we grasp reality, how we map reality, into a kind of idealistic, totalistic religion. And that's when Gnosticism goes bad, is when it goes towards totalism and imposes that idea onto human experience. So it's a complicated answer to a simple question, but I think the question is too simple.
Yeah, and modern sociologists use the term neo-Gnosticism to mean any system that has a series of steps or initiations, such as Scientology. But there probably were almost 200 different Gnostic groups in the record. The followers of Valentinus, the Valentinians are relatively well known, the Manichees.
Yeah, the word Neoplatonist also falls in line here, because a lot of Gnosticism derives from Plato and applying it to the teachings of Jesus.
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting. Alexa asks, any thoughts on deep brain reorienting? Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I don't think I do, actually. My deep brain has been reoriented, and I don't.
No,
and yes, I did mention Jimi Hendrix. Absolutely, I did.
You wrote a book on Jimi Hendrix, right?
I wrote a book where Jimi Hendrix is a character called Voodoo Child's Slight Return. I brought him back in about the year 2000, and it was great.
That was his band in the UK, right? Slight Return, if I remember correctly.
No, it's the name of the track on Electric Ladyland that he has Voodoo Child, which is the long 15-minute jam with Steve Winwood, which is wonderful. But he then has the
amazing.
That's Voodoo Child Slight Return. And that came about because in 1993, I met Margaret Singer, professor at Berkeley, who Joe knew quite well, I think. And I'd have been 10 years out of occult, and I said, I've never asked anybody to therap me, which is what she called therapy. Would you see me? And 6 months later, when I was back at Berkeley, I went and I spent 3 hours with her, and neither of us had prepared anything. And I was delighted to find out that her approach was the same as mine. You ask somebody what they think is the problem, let them ramble about it. When they start repeating themselves, you say, what do you think you could do about it? And then there'll be like 5 things they could do about it.
Yeah.
One of them will land them in prison. 3 of them are crazy, and the other might work. And you say, we'll do that. But when I sat down and started talking, and I have no idea, I hadn't thought about it at all. I sat down. I said, when I was 15, I went to the Isle of Wight and I saw Jimi Hendrix perform. And 18 days later, he was dead.
Oh, wow.
And it really upset me. And so a few years, 6 years later, I wrote a novel where it meant I could have 2 years to study Jimi Hendrix's life in great detail. And I was really pleased. There was a guy, he runs something called the Jimi Hendrix Management Institute, which collects a library of everything ever said about Hendrix. And he wrote to me, he said, can I have 2 copies of your book for free? So I said, okay, as long as you publish a review. And he published a review. And he basically said, this is a dreadful book. It's all about mysticism and nonsense. But he did not correct a single fact, nor did he correct the projection of how I thought Hendrix would probably think. And I'm very happy to say that I've discovered that Hendrix was actually a very clever man. I thought he just was the great musical genius of the decade, but he was also a very smart, thoughtful man. Last night I found a film version, and I didn't realize there was film of it, of the version of Machine Gun that's on Band of Gypsies. You can find it on YouTube. Somebody's put silly psychedelic effects on it, but to watch him playing that unbelievable solo, quite remarkable.
Yeah, remarkable guy. Part of the 27 Club. Guys, this is Jon Atack's website here. It's jonatack.co.uk. You can check him out there. Go subscribe to his YouTube channel. It's Jon Atack Family and Friends. And then Joe Szimhart's YouTube channel is Joe Szimhart 9431. I'll put links to all 3 of those sites in the show notes. Is there anything you guys like to add or anything I missed before we end the stream?
Just thank you so much. It's been great fun.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you for allowing us to talk about Jon's book. I think it's very important.
Oh, I agree. I'm glad that we made this happen. Again, the guests are Joe Szimhart. This is his YouTube channel. And then I'll bring up the new book by Jon Atack, A-T-A-C-K. If Scientology Ruled the World, Nazi Occultists, Sex Magic, Space Aliens, and the Second Coming. Thank you both for your time. Really appreciate it.
And it's available as an ebook, as a print book, as an audio book, as a T-shirt, as a mug, and as a small furry animal.
Good. You can get it in Amazon or any other purveyor of
probably just Amazon
or whatever,
moment,
merch, I guess, merch.
Yeah.
Or you can go to Jon Atack and his website and ask him where to get all that stuff. So go to his website and follow up with these guys if you have any questions. But both of you, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Willem.
All right, Steve.